few years back, I was staying at my girlfriend's dad's house with her for a month. It was situated between a large section of woods and a lake. Her dad owned many acres of land, including much of the nearby woods. He even had this little, I don't want to say path, but very narrow clearing in the woods that I'd like to walk through to clear my head. It was this one unnaturally foggy day that I wanted to go for a walk in the woods. I put on my boots that I'd use for hiking and told my girlfriend I'd be back in a little while. She didn't like to walk in the woods, so I'd always do it alone. Walking into the narrow clearing in the woods, I really took in how foggy it was that day. I couldn't see 15 feet in front of me. I hadn't seen it like that in years. In fact, I haven't seen it that foggy since. But as long as I'd stay in the clearing, I'd be able to find my way back.
Working across teams is tough, but Asana helps you handle it. That's because Asana is where humans and AI coordinate work together. AI can spot roadblocks and assign work in a snap, so everything and everyone stays on track. That's how work gets handled. That's Asana. Visit us at asana.com. That's ASANA.com.
Walking through the clearing, I thought I could hear my footsteps being mirrored, as in synchronized with someone else's steps. So I stopped and listened. This was private property. Nobody should be here except for me. So I calmly called, "Hello?" When I didn't hear any calls back or footsteps, I felt it was safe to continue walking. The woods had a very eerie vibe with the thick clouds of fog floating through the trees. Crunches on the floor of the woods from my boots and the sounds of evening crickets was just about all I heard. A calming vibe. Then I heard it. A moaning-like breathing noise. Like an old man moaning in discomfort. This time I knew I wasn't alone. It sounded like someone was hurt. I walked towards the noise, concerned, once more calling out, "Hello?" I stopped when I sharpened my senses a little and noticed the figure of a person standing just far enough away in the fog in front of me where I could see their presence there, but that's just about it. Just a really tall figure in the fog. That was the person making the moaning sounds. I crept a little closer, asking if the person needed assistance, but I didn't exactly get a better view. So I walked a little closer, and still, it didn't feel like I was getting any closer to the person. I yelled this time, and the moaning stopped. I took 2 more big steps this time towards the figure, and that's when I realized that no matter how much I walked forward, this person, this figure, didn't seem to get any closer. I turned around and started walking back through the clearing in the direction of my girlfriend's dad's house. I looked over my shoulder about 5 seconds later and swallowed my gum, seeing that the figure now behind was still the exact same distance it had been this entire time. I started running, heart racing, running short on breath rather quickly. And every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw that figure hovering the same distance behind me. And I use the word hovering now, because I eventually picked up on the fact that I couldn't see the outline of the lower part of the figure's legs. It just looked like this floating apparition in the fog. I eventually made it out of the woods back to the yard of the house. I took one last look at the tree line while it was still in sight through the fog, and I saw the person, figure, apparition, whatever I should call it, right by the tree line. I burst in through the back door of the house, slammed it shut out of breath. And when my girlfriend, her dad, and her brother came in response to my noise, I pointed out into the fog at the tree line, telling them someone or something was following me in the woods, no matter how fast I ran. Her dad put on his shoes and went outside with me real quick. I pointed to where I last saw the figure in the woods, and it was gone. He patted my shoulder and told me I had nothing to worry about. With he and I being 2 6-foot dudes, and with the 2 dogs in the house, no one would be breaking in here. I laughed and pretended for a second as if I wasn't mentally scarred for life from what just happened. I'm not one to believe in ghosts or anything of that nature, but this was definitely the closest thing to paranormal I'd ever experienced. It still sends shivers up my spine to this day. While in the process of moving from my parents' place in Staten Island to Manhattan, I was using a lot of apps like Craigslist and Letgo for new furniture. I had already gotten the apartment in Manhattan by the point of this story, but I was still spending most of my time in my parents' house while I was still finishing up furnishing the apartment. I was on the app Letgo, and I found a really cheap, nice-looking dresser that matched the rest of my furniture. I messaged the guy whose name was Jake, and he was quick with his responses. We set up a time and place to meet that night, outside his house on some dead end by a little park. He said he worked late shifts, and his only available time to meet would be past 10 most nights. That was fine for me, though. I didn't have work that week. The meetup time was 10:30. I wanted to be a little early because honestly, the later it got, the sketchier things would feel. I got to his house at like 10:15 or maybe earlier, but it was an intensely foggy night. I couldn't even see if there were other cars parked in the street. Literally seconds after I parked at the dead end, I got a message from Jake on Letgo saying, "You're early. Just give me a second, I'll be right out." I thought, what in the world? How did he know I arrived that second? Was he watching from somewhere in the fog? Still, I replied, okay, and looked around even harder now. I realized there weren't really any houses on this street, at least not normal-looking houses. It was an unusually secluded street for Staten Island with some small buildings that I couldn't even make out what they were for. Eventually, Jake sent me another message saying, "Come on out, the dresser's waiting out back." Out back where, though? I couldn't see anything. I got out from my car while replying back to him asking where I should go. That's where the responses on the app stopped, and the yells "over here" started. I followed the voice of this Jake person through the fog. I felt as if I were in some bizarre horror scenario. Following his voice, I'd occasionally shout, "I'm coming." I walked through this narrow alleyway-like thing between these two buildings. This wasn't a neighborhood street at all. I called out for Jake as I got through the alleyway to a backyard-type area. I didn't know if it was big or small because the fog, mixed with the darkness, wouldn't let me see more than 6 feet in front of me. Jake was no longer calling out for me. It just went completely dead silent, except for the sound of distant nighttime traffic. I knew in my gut something wasn't right. I was about to make my way back out of there. "Wait, your dresser's just right inside here. Come inside." I heard his voice in front of me, but I could not see him. I didn't respond. I just started backing away towards the small alleyway. I turned around. I could see other people standing mere feet away from me. Even through the thick fog, I could see them just standing stiff up against some wall or fence. Something bad was going on here. I began a sprint back through the way I came, and I saw and heard I was being chased by at least 3 different people. I didn't run for my truck, as I wouldn't have time to get in, start it, and do a 3-point turn. I ran down the road till I couldn't run anymore and got the police on the phone. 2 police cars pulled down the road eventually. One of them picked me up when I waved them down. We got to the location and we went to the little yard area. There weren't any people still back there. The 2 little buildings were both abandoned storefronts. The back door was wide open, but inside was literally nothing. Do I even need to say it? No dresser, obviously. I showed the officers the Letgo conversation. All I had to do was give them the account that posted it, and that would allow them to open an investigation. But somehow nothing ever came of it. I'm not sure how thoroughly the police department even investigated this. All I know is something very, very bad was going to happen to me if I went in that building. Last Saturday, while I'm writing this, it was an insanely foggy day. My family and I are quarantined in Jersey. My wife was out shopping, and my son was in his room. I was trying to get work done on my computer in my office room when my 6-year-old daughter Veronica came inside, saying she saw someone in the garden. I left the office to the window looking in the backyard where the garden is. And indeed, she was right. There was someone standing over my garden. Their back was to us, but they didn't appear to be doing anything, and I know it sounds unbelievable, but I really couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. That's how foggy it was. I knocked on the glass to try and scare them away. I saw them turn their head, then walk over my garden deeper into the fog until we couldn't see them anymore. I told Veronica to wait inside while I slipped on my shoes and walked out into the fog real quick. The person only walked deeper into my property. See, we live in what I guess kids call bumblefuck, so I have a large yard. Obviously, seeing someone on this yard is unsettling, and my natural reaction was to follow in the direction I saw the person walk. I started to hear a rhythmic thumping noise, and as I got closer to my shed, I realized it was coming from there. The shed came into view when I got close enough, and I saw the person at the door of it, apparently slamming the door shut over and over again. I yelled, "Get out of here," before I called the police. I stepped closer and got a better look at the person. It was some middle-aged woman. She looked disheveled. She said sorry at least 10 times as she literally ran away from me in the direction of the road, quickly disappearing in the fog.
At the University of Arizona Global Campus, we are proud to offer over 50 career-focused online programs to a fierce community of Wildcats from around the globe. Proud to be UAGC. Learn more at uagc.edu.
Later that night, after my wife and I turned off the TV and tried to get to sleep, the dead silence in the room revealed a sound coming from outside. It was coming from the backyard. I recognized it as the slamming of the shed door again. I felt sick realizing this. My wife was shaking me, telling me to go out there and chase whoever it was off. I didn't tell her about the woman because I didn't want to scare her. I slipped on my shoes, grabbed a flashlight, and turned on every backyard light on the house. I went outside immediately yelling, trying to sound intimidating. The slamming stopped. It was still foggy out. I had to walk a little bit to be able to see the shed. The shed door was open. The woman wasn't anywhere in sight. I have to admit, I was downright terrified to go into the pitch black shed at that moment. I figured she had to be in there, but this is what you do as the man of the house. In my best words, I charged into the shed screaming as once again some intimidation factor, but the shed didn't have anyone in it except me. So I shut the door and twisted the little lock on the handle. I yelled some threat about calling the police really, really loud, and then went back into the house. I turned off all the backyard lights, and as I was walking back to my bedroom, Veronica came up to me crying. "What's wrong?" I asked her. She replied, "Look out my window." Those words hit me hard. I ran to her room, keeping the light off, and saw that woman standing at her window trying to open it. I got a clear view of the woman now, and her face was nothing short of horrific. She had droopy, cracked skin, her hair was wiry and grayish. She looked like her teeth were probably effed up too. There was clearly something wrong with this woman, and I had to assume she was dangerous. I screamed at her to leave us alone, and then went for the phone to call 911. The woman ran off for good this time. The cops couldn't really do anything except alert other officers over the radio. It's been less than a week, and yesterday my shed door was left open again from some point in the night. I'm really getting freaked out for my family. I fear one of these nights I'll wake up and she'll be inside the house. This happened last year. I was 22 at the time, completely burnt out from work, and I was going through one of those stretches where everything in life felt like it was happening to someone else. I won't get into specifics, but let's just say I had a colorful past, and by that point, I was actively trying to put some distance between myself and certain chapters of my life. What I needed more than anything was to disappear for a few days. We've all been there. I must have been venting out loud because one day at work, I found myself having a conversation with a coworker about this tiny island off the coast of Maine. The way he described it, the place sounded almost aggressively boring. No nightlife, barely any tourists after dark, and most people just took the ferry out for the day and left before sunset. He said if you stayed overnight, it was like having the whole island to yourself, which was exactly what I was looking for. I found a vacation rental listing for a standalone cottage right on the shoreline. The price was suspiciously cheap, and it was available on short notice, which probably should have raised some flags, but I wasn't exactly in a cautious headspace. I booked it without thinking twice. The cottage itself was small, just a single room with a bed, an unused kitchenette, and a bathroom the size of a closet. It was set back from the water, surrounded on three sides by thick brush that pressed right up against the walls. The front faced the ocean, with a single window covered by this thin, semi-translucent curtain that didn't do much to block the view in either direction. The walls were paper thin. I could hear the wind moving through the brush like it was right next to my ear. The door had a deadbolt and a chain lock that both looked like they'd been installed recently, which struck me as a little odd for such an isolated spot, but I didn't dwell on it. I took the late afternoon ferry over and spent the early evening just walking around the island. It was kind of surreal watching the place empty out as the day visitors filtered back to the mainland. By the time the sun went down, there was almost no one left. No streetlights, no ambient noise, nothing. I was pretty much left alone to enjoy the sounds of the ocean by myself. It was beautiful. I grabbed dinner at this little pub near the ferry landing. The bartender was friendly enough, but I noticed that she gave me a weird face when I told her where I was staying. On the walk back, I passed a small dock tucked into a cave maybe 100 yards from the cottage. There was a single blue motorboat moored over there. It stood out because all the other boats I'd seen on the island were larger lobster vessels. I made a mental note of it, but didn't think too much beyond that.
When that personalization happens, you are getting better care.
I got back to the cottage around 10:30, locked the deadbolt in the chain, and settled in for the night. Up until that point, I was really enjoying the time away from everything. But of course, that peace didn't last. I realized my phone charger was busted, or maybe it was the outlet I was using. But the point is, my phone wouldn't charge no matter what I tried. I tried every outlet in the cottage. My phone was on low battery, and I was 100% sure it was going to die within the hour. Luckily, I didn't really need it to get back to the ferry. I had a physical ticket, but no one likes having a dead phone. I decided to just call it a night and go to sleep. I was exhausted anyway, and I did fall asleep pretty quickly actually. The exhaustion from the past few nights hit me all at once, and I was out within a few minutes of my head hitting the pillow. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. I don't know what pulled me out of my sleep exactly, but once I was awake, I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside the cottage. They were close, right in front of the door, and whoever was out there was taking their time, which I could tell because there was a long pause in between each step. It definitely didn't sound like an animal scurrying around. I shifted in bed just slightly, and the footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was uncomfortable in a way that I couldn't really describe. It stretched on long enough that I started to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, or that it really had just been an animal. I didn't want to move, so I just stared at the ceiling in that same position. I'm not sure what I was waiting for, but I was so freaked out that I couldn't even think straight. And a few minutes later, the footsteps came back. This time there was no mistaking the direction. They weren't passing by, they were approaching. I heard them come right up to the entrance of the cottage and stopped directly in front of the door. At that point, my heart was damn near pounding out of my chest. I felt like they could hear it, but there was nothing I could do besides try and be as silent as possible. As if the situation wasn't bad enough, whoever was out there turned on a flashlight and tried shining it through the front door. I couldn't move because I was petrified in fear. That person clicked off the light and tried the door handle. I shut my eyes and prayed the deadbolt would hold, and it did. I thought that would be enough of a deterrent, but I was wrong. A few seconds passed, and then they tried again, putting more weight into it this time. Then came several hard bangs, one after another. The sound was so loud in that tiny little cottage that I actually flinched with each impact. The bangs activated my brain though. The threat was more real, and even though I was still terrified, I knew I had to do something. So without thinking, I jumped out of bed while that person was still banging on the door and crouched down behind it. I was fully prepared for what was about to happen, but instead of that person bursting through the door, everything went quiet. I stayed crouched down for a few seconds, trying not to breathe too loudly. And then, I still remember this vividly, whoever was on the other side of the door spoke. "I know you're in there, Leo." I almost yelled out in shock, but I stopped myself. It was a man's voice, one I didn't recognize, but he somehow knew my name. He knew I was there. The footsteps moved away from the door and along the side of the cottage. I tracked the sound as it passed the bathroom wall and continued around. He was taunting me. He knew I was in there. My confidence was gone. Hearing my own name was enough to make me dizzy. It was the scariest moment of my entire life. Over the next stretch of time, I have no idea how long, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour, whoever was outside circled the cottage. I had no idea what they were doing, and a part of me was screaming for them to just break down the door and get it over with already. Eventually, the footsteps receded from the cottage. Then, from the direction of the dock, I heard an engine start. It was the unmistakable sound of a small outboard motor. I listened as it pulled away from the shore and faded into the distance across open water. I didn't sleep after that. That's not an exaggeration. I stayed awake the entire night. The second it was bright enough to see, I was out the door. The gravel around the cottage told the whole story. There were heavy boot prints circling the cottage multiple times. The prints led in a straight line from the cottage toward the dock and ended right at the water line. The next day was honestly a blur. I returned the key to the property owner, boarded a ferry, and made it home. But I was not in a good headspace. Here's the thing that still gets me. Whoever was outside that cottage didn't come from the island. They came by boat, specifically to that cottage, and on that specific night. They knew my name and exactly where I'd be. The thing is, I have absolutely no idea how they could have tracked me down. I confronted my coworker about it a few days later, the one who told me about that island in the first place, and he swore up and down he hadn't told anyone about my trip. And honestly, I believed him. He looked genuinely freaked out when I told him what happened. I mentioned earlier that I have a colorful past. I'm not going to get into the details, but let's just say, I'm not exactly shocked that someone out there might want to find me. What I still can't wrap my head around is, how did someone track me to some random island off the coast of Maine? How did they know which rental I booked, and on which night? How long had they been watching me before any of this? I don't have any answers to any of those questions, and the worst part is, I still work the same job and live in the same place. Nothing has changed since then, but I have no reason to believe things are over. This happened many, many years ago. I'm a structural engineer, and at the time I was finishing up my graduate thesis on concrete degradation in marine environments. It was very boring, but it's what got me invited to Japan. This is all relevant, by the way. I was in Nagasaki for an academic conference. There was this professor I'd been corresponding with who had done extensive research on post-industrial decay. His name was Dr. Yamamoto, and he pulled some strings and arranged something I never thought I'd get access to, a research permit for Hashima Island. If you don't know Hashima, you've probably seen pictures of it without realizing. It's this tiny island off the coast of Nagasaki that looks like a battleship, completely covered in crumbling concrete apartment blocks. It used to be a coal mining operation, one of the most densely populated places on Earth at its peak. They abandoned it in the 70s when the coal ran out, and it's been rotting ever since. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. Tourists can technically visit, but only on guided tours that stick to a narrow concrete path along the seawall. Civilians are expressly forbidden from entering the actual buildings due to structural integrity concerns. But I wasn't subject to the same restrictions, of course, which was thrilling and a little scary. I had to sign an exhaustive stack of papers, basically waiving my right to damages should I injure myself or something. The morning of the visit, I took an early ferry from Nagasaki. It wasn't a tourist boat, but rather a smaller vessel arranged through the research office. It was just me and my escort, a guy named Takeshi. He didn't talk much. I didn't really mind because I was so hyped about the excursion, The approach to Hashima plays tricks on your eyes. When it first appears within your line of sight, it looks deceptively small, insignificant almost. But then, as you get closer, the scale of it hits you. The seawall wrapping around the entire island, the apartment blocks stacked on top of each other. It really is something else. I had seen hundreds of photos, but none of them prepared me for actually laying my eyes on what I can only describe as a true wonder. Takeshi gave me the briefing on the dock. I had access to several buildings beyond the normal tour route. He actually had a list. But there were still rules, such as stay on designated paths, don't enter anything marked with red tape, don't remove anything, don't touch anything you don't need to, and stay within visual range of him at all times. He said that last part twice. I also had to wear a hard hat, steel-toed boots, and these bulky reinforced work pants that made it a little difficult to walk. Despite all the excess gear, the first couple hours were amazing. I was taking photos, taking notes, completely in my element. Takeshi followed at a distance, occasionally glancing at his watch. He clearly wanted this over with. We entered one of the large residential blocks around midday. The stairs were intact, but barely. You could see daylight through the gaps in the landing. Takeshi waited on the ground floor while I went up, which I thought was a little strange given his whole stay within visual range speech, but I wasn't going to argue. It was kind of irritating having him follow me around anyway. I was on the 4th floor examining a section of wall where the concrete had completely separated from the rebar underneath when I noticed something off. The dust patterns were wrong. There was dust everywhere, obviously decades of it, but there was this path through it, like someone had been walking this route regularly. Not recently maybe, but often enough that the dust hadn't fully settled back. I followed it with my eye and realized it led to a room at the end of the corridor. I should have gone back down to tell Takeshi, which would have been the smart thing, but I was curious and wanted to check things out for myself. He probably would have just ushered me back downstairs anyway, depriving me of ever getting an answer. So I carefully walked over to the room and pushed the door open. I immediately noticed two things, both of which were incredibly unsettling. Firstly, there was this weird smell emanating from the room that I didn't recognize. It didn't really smell like anything natural, but I couldn't recognize it as any kind of human smell either. I know that makes no sense, but that specific smell was genuinely something I have never encountered before. The second thing was even more confusing. The wall I touched was hot, or at least noticeably warmer than any of the other surfaces I'd felt on the island. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds trying to process it. You might be thinking the warmth was probably due to sun exposure, and yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's what I was thinking too, even though there weren't any gaps in the ceiling. And I figured the smell could have been animals, even though I wasn't aware that any animals even lived on Hashima. I went back down and mentioned it to Takeshi. His reaction was immediate and strange. He didn't ask me any clarifying questions or even seem that concerned. He just told me that what I saw was impossible, and that no humans or animals lived on the island. He didn't even ask me to take him to that room. When I insisted that he follow me so I could show him the smell for himself, he flatly refused. His reaction was really disturbing, to be quite honest. We continued the tour, and I started being much more observant every time he allowed me to enter a building. I kept noticing weird things. Nothing fully revealing like clothes or anything like that, but weird markings and signs that something had been there. I say something because I didn't know whether I was seeing signs of a person or signs of an animal, which was the most confusing part. At one point, I mentioned more of these sightings to Takeshi, and this time he didn't even respond. Instead, he just pulled out his radio and spoke rapid Japanese into it. I had no idea what he was saying or who he was even talking to, but it was the first time he had used the radio since we got off the boat. When I asked him what he said, he told me he was checking the schedule. I obviously didn't believe him, but what was I supposed to do? Demand that he tell me what he said? I just ignored him, but I was significantly more unsettled after that. It was almost like he knew what was going on and just didn't want to tell me. We reached a taller residential block near the center of the island. Takeshi hesitated at the entrance. He actually stopped walking and stood there for a few seconds before following me in. I remember thinking that was weird. He'd been bored and impatient all morning, and now he was all attentive? But I didn't care. I wasn't going to let someone else's attitude stop me from exploring. The stairwell was narrow and dark, but structurally sound. We went up maybe 5 floors. Takeshi was right behind me the whole time, which felt like a change from his earlier indifference. And then, after walking into one of the corner rooms up there changed from his earlier indifference. And then, after walking into one of the corner rooms up there, I saw something that immediately validated all my previous concerns. Against one of the walls was a pile of blankets and a few empty bottles of water. There was no mistake about it this time. I was looking at definitive evidence of human habitation. I regained my composure after the initial shock and turned to show Takeshi. There was no way I was going to allow him to dismiss my claims this time. But when I stepped out of the room, he was gone. I don't know why, but seeing those items in that room didn't terrify me until I realized I was alone up there. It was like Takeshi having disappeared unlocked my brain, and only then was I able to process how scary the situation truly was. There was someone else on that island. I suddenly felt a very acute urge to strip out of my gear and scratch myself. My whole body was itching, and I was starting to freak out. I frantically made my way back to the stairwell we'd come up, thinking I'd just run down and end the trip short. But no, as if things weren't bad enough, I turned the corner and realized the stairs were blocked. There was a pile of rubble spilled across the landing, enough that I couldn't get through. I didn't have time to think about whether it had collapsed naturally or whether someone had piled it there purposefully. I just turned and ran. I ran past that room and down the corridor, praying that there was another stairwell somewhere close by. I didn't care about the structural damage anymore. I was so scared and didn't care about anything other than getting the hell out of there. As I was sprinting down the hall, I heard movement from somewhere behind me. It sounded like footsteps stepping out into the hallway. I didn't turn around, no chance in hell. I just kept running. The only problem was that it was like a maze in there. I was too scared to think straight, and I felt like I was running in circles. The whole time I could hear footsteps behind me. At first I thought it was Takeshi, but after a while I realized there were multiple sets of footsteps, which meant I was being followed by multiple people. I finally found another stairwell, and I practically jumped down it. I don't remember much about getting out of the building. I remember daylight and then sprinting across open ground and then the dock. Takeshi was just standing there by the boat. Seeing how unfazed he looked took me from scared to downright angry. I started screaming at him about what I had seen, about the people in that building, about him abandoning me, everything. I think I even accused him of piling that rubble up in an attempt to strand me in there. He barely even blinked. It was like he wasn't hearing what I was saying. I wanted to put my hands on him, but that would have been a terrible idea. He was my way off the island. He had all the power. I had none. The way he didn't even react to what I was saying only made me angrier. At one point, I actually kind of hoped that whoever had been stalking me in that building would turn a corner so Takeshi would believe me. He waited for me to finally calm down, and then instead of acknowledging anything I had said, he just said we were leaving. I didn't know what to think. I was still pretty unsettled and scared at what had just happened, but I was also horrified that this guy was refusing to acknowledge any of it. It genuinely made me think that he knew something about what had happened. Or worse, maybe he had caused it himself. Maybe he had been the one to pile that rubble. But the worst part was that I had to sit through an entire ferry ride back to the mainland with him. I was genuinely worried for my safety, but we made it back, and that was that. As soon as I got somewhere safe, the first thing I wanted to do was report my sightings. That there were people on Hashima. That was extremely concerning. So I contacted the only person I could think to contact. The only person who had any connection to both me and the island. Dr. Yamamoto. But I couldn't get a hold of him. Fast forward 2 weeks. I was back in the US at that point, and I still couldn't get a hold of him. It was like he had disappeared. I tried my best to report what I had seen to the relevant authorities, but I don't think anything came of it. I don't think anyone believed me. It's been years and years and years since this all happened, but this is a story I'll tell anyone who will listen. Strangely, the thing that gets to me the most isn't what happened on the island, but what happened after. The fact that I couldn't get in contact with Dr. Yamamoto, despite him going to great lengths to arrange my visit to the island. The thing I regret the most is not taking more action to get to the bottom of what was going on there. If I had spoken Japanese, or if I didn't have to return to the US so quickly, I might have been able to do something. This is something I'm gonna think about forever. This happened a long time ago. I'm talking 10 plus years. It was during my very last semester of college. I was majoring in history, and I was deep into my senior thesis, which focused on abandoned institutional spaces, places like defunct hospitals, asylums, rehab centers, especially ones that still existed in or around major cities. One of the cases I was writing about was North Brother Island. It was this overgrown island right in the East River, technically part of New York City, but it had been completely abandoned for decades. As far as I know, it's still exactly the same, but I haven't been in New York City in forever, so I really wouldn't know. Here's a very abbreviated history. It used to house a quarantine hospital, then a rehab center, and then at some point in the distant past it became off limits to the public. Unless something's changed, you still need a permit to even set foot there. In fact, it's probably even more heavily guarded considering how seriously the US takes security and whatnot these days. That's all you really need to know about it, but for any fellow history buffs out there, feel free to do your own research. You might even find my thesis. I never actually planned on going, that would have been illegal, but I mentioned it offhand one night to two of my friends, Jansen and Jesse, while we were drinking. I was probably pissed at how long it was taking, knowing how lazy and unproductive I was back then. Surprisingly, they both thought my thesis sounded really interesting, despite the fact that neither of them were history majors. So I told them some of the interesting tidbits about the various places I was researching. The moment they realized one of the places was quite literally tucked away in the very city we were sitting in, they were hooked. Jansen and Jesse, and I guess myself by extension, were really into that whole urban exploring, edgy vibe back then. Back then, it was decently popular among young guys at the time. They both thought it sounded like the perfect target for an urban exploration trip, and I'll admit, after all the research I'd done, I was curious too. Not in a ghost hunter way or anything, but more like, if I was going to describe the place in my thesis, why not actually see it with my own eyes? Fast forward a few weeks, and that's how we found ourselves sneaking through Barretto Point Park in the Bronx at 2 a.m. with 3 solo kayaks in tow. It was one of the few spots along the shoreline where you could launch without attracting too much attention, and it was only about a half-mile paddle to the island. We had a bunch of supplies, probably more than we needed, but we figured we'd play it safe. The plan was to leave around 2:30, explore the island for a few hours while it was still dark, and be back before sunrise. It felt stupid and thrilling at the same time, the best kind of fun. Getting our kayaks into the water was surprisingly seamless. I guess I hadn't anticipated how deserted the park was going to be at that time of night. But as soon as we started paddling toward the island, the reality of what we were doing began setting in. There wasn't anything stopping us anymore. All we had to do was paddle at that point, and a bit of nervousness started creeping into what had just moments earlier been pure excitement. Regardless, we made it to the island. Pulling the kayaks onto shore was a bit of a struggle because of all the overgrowth. We had to push through some tall reeds and weeds just to find a somewhat stable spot to leave them. Once we were on solid ground, the three of us just kind of stood there for a second, taking it all in. It was dark, obviously, but we had flashlights, and the moon was bright enough that you could make out the general shapes of things. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it all was. I know that sounds cliche, but you have to understand, we were technically still in New York City. The Bronx was right there, maybe half a mile away, and yet it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. We started walking inland. It didn't take long for Jansen and Jesse to realize just how big the island actually was. I had told them beforehand that it wasn't some tiny little rock. I think I even showed them a map at some point, but they clearly hadn't internalized it. As we made our way deeper, we started passing building after building. Most of them partially collapsed or so overgrown that you could barely tell they were buildings at all. At one point, Jesse stopped and just stared at this one structure that had a tree literally splitting it in half. He said it looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic video game, like one of the ones where you're scavenging through the ruins of civilization. He wasn't wrong, that's exactly what it felt like. There was something almost alien about the way nature had reclaimed everything, like the island was actively trying to swallow any evidence that humans had ever been there. I remember thinking that if I didn't know better, I'd assume the place had been empty for centuries, not decades. We explored a few of the more intact buildings, shining our flashlights into rooms that hadn't seen visitors in God knows how long. Most of them were empty, but in one of the larger buildings, Jansen found something on the ground near a doorway, a half-empty can of spray paint. He immediately wanted to use it, and Jesse was on board. I told them no, that it felt disrespectful, not just to the buildings, but to the history of the place. People had lived there and people had died there, but they pointed out that there was already graffiti all over the walls, some of it pretty elaborate, and argued that a little more wasn't going to make a difference. I didn't have the energy to keep fighting about it, so I told them I wasn't going to stop them, but I wasn't going to stick around and watch either. In hindsight, wandering off was probably a mistake. I made my way through a few more rooms, trying to take mental notes for my thesis, but the further I got from Jansen and Jesse, the more unsettling everything became. It's hard to explain unless you've been in a situation like that. When you're with other people, even in a creepy place, there's a buffer. You can tell yourself it's fine because nothing bad would happen with witnesses around or whatever. But being alone is a completely different story. I was walking down a long hallway in one of the larger buildings. I think it might have been part of the old hospital complex, when I heard Jesse's voice call my name from somewhere ahead of me, from one of the rooms further down the hall. The sound of it made me jump, and even though I knew it was him, I was still pretty freaked out. I started walking toward it, and something began to feel off. For Jesse to be ahead of me, he would have had to take a completely different route through the building. That wasn't impossible. There were multiple hallways and stairways, but it would have meant he left Jansen almost immediately after I did, and then speed walked or even ran just to loop around and end up in front of me. That didn't make any sense. Why would he do that? There were too many rooms branching off from the hallway, and I couldn't tell exactly which one the voice had come from, so I called out to him, asking where he was. I got a response almost immediately from a room just a few doors down on my left. It was definitely Jansen's voice, and all he said was, "In here." I walked toward it. The doorway was dark, darker than the hallway, which was already pretty dark, and I couldn't see anything inside. I figured Jesse and Jansen were probably just messing with me, trying to scare me for wandering off, which is exactly the kind of thing Jansen would think was hilarious. I stepped into the room without really thinking about it, and swept my flashlight around the room. It landed on a figure standing in the far corner of the room, facing the wall. For a split second, my brain tried to convince me it was one of my friends, but it wasn't. It couldn't be. Whoever this was, they were really tall, easily 6.5 feet, maybe more. Neither Jansen nor Jesse were anywhere close to that height. I can't express how scary seeing that figure was. I screamed. I couldn't help myself. I ran out of that room as fast as I could. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I was yelling for Jansen and Jesse to run as loudly as I could. I've never been more scared in my life. I felt like whoever had been in that room was going to catch me, or something else would jump out from one of the many pitch-black rooms I was running past. I found my friends near where we'd originally split up. When they saw me sprinting toward them, they just started running too. We didn't stop until we reached the kayaks. Once we caught our breath, I told them everything. They didn't believe me at first, which I completely understood. If Jansen had told me the same story, I would have assumed he was messing with me. But I pleaded with them to believe me, that I wasn't making it up, and after a minute or so, they actually started to look more scared than me. We decided to just leave. Whatever we'd come to see, it wasn't worth sticking around after that. But right as we started dragging the kayaks back toward the water, All three of us heard it at the same time. It was faint but distinct. A moaning sound coming from somewhere in the darkness behind us. It sounded like a woman, an older woman, either crying or wincing in pain. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough that we could hear it clearly if we focused. None of us said anything, but I could tell Jesse and Jansen were losing it. I was too. My hands were shaking. We finally got the kayaks into the water. The paddle back felt like it took forever, but we made it. The whole drive, none of us could stop talking about what happened. We went over every detail, trying to make sense of it, trying to come up with some rational explanation. But the thing I kept coming back to, the thing that freaked me out the most, was the voice. Because that was definitely Jesse's voice I heard in that hallway. I know Jesse's voice as well as I know my own, and whatever called out to me sounded exactly like him. Except Jesse was nowhere near that part of the building. He was with Jansen the whole time. I've thought about going back to the island over the years, but I never have. For one thing, I'm pretty sure it's basically impossible now. From what I've read, they've really cracked down on unauthorized access. Even if I wanted to, I don't think I could get within 100 yards of that place without getting intercepted by someone. I really don't believe in the paranormal, I never have, but I have a hard time explaining what happened that night any other way. Someone was on that island with us, someone who knew my name, someone who could make their voice sound exactly like Jesse's. I don't think I'll ever get an answer to what happened that night.
The drive out took a few hours. As I pulled off the main highway and onto the branching road, I was struck with the sense that I was going to be very alone out here. I'm an avid hiker, but since many of the hiking trails I'd normally frequent had become almost crowded as of late, for this trip, I settled on a trail I'd vaguely heard of, but knew next to nothing about. It led up towards some serious wild territory, with nothing around for hundreds of miles. The land was technically part of the nearby national parks, but was only barely mentioned on the park's website. I suspected this was because it was much further out than the regularly visited trails, only accessible from a branching road that pretty much led to nowhere. My plan was to head into the wilderness and camp out overnight under the stars. I live in a desert state. No, I won't tell you which one, and I figured there'd be some stunning views of the constellations in the cloudless sky at night, especially since it was forecast to be a moonless night. I'd already walked the popular day trails in the area, so I was looking for something a bit further off-field. The plan was to camp out under the stars and head back in the morning. The deserted road suggested I was right in thinking that nobody came this far out. Should be a good chance to relax and get away from it all. Eventually I reached my destination and pulled off the asphalt of the road and into the gravel of the parking area, tires crunching as I slowed to a stop off to one side. Parking lot would have been too generous a title. It was really just an unsealed area next to the highway with a signpost announcing the entrance to National Park territory. The area was almost empty, only a single other car parked up. I got out and stretched, looking around and spotting the low sign that marked the trailhead. As I did, I took a second glance at the other parked car. It looked like it had been there for an age. All four tires were flat, although they didn't look to be punctured. Every surface was dusty. I looked back at my car, which was lightly coated from the drive-in. But this was well and truly caked on. There were no broken windows, and it didn't look like it had been stolen and dumped. It didn't look damaged at all. It must have been here for a while, I thought to myself, wondering why no one from the park services had towed it by now. I made a mental note to call them when I got home. I opened the door to my back seat and got out my pack, hat, and rifle. I'd thought hard about whether to bring the rifle. It was extra weight after all, and odds were I wouldn't need it. But last time I'd been out hiking overnight, I had a far too close encounter with a coyote that left me wishing I had something more than rocks to protect myself with. I figured since it was only a small .22 caliber, it wouldn't be too heavy, and I packed it into a light, soft case that fit alongside my backpack. I reached into my pack for my sunscreen and slathered some on my arms and neck before turning off my phone. I'd called my sister before I left town to let her know my plans, and stowed it and my keys away, shouldering my things and setting off up the trail. I'd gone more than a couple of 100 yards when I slowed to a stop, nose in the air. There was the slightest breeze, but with it came a hint of something behind it. I winced as the warm air hit my face, because the smell it wafted towards me was terrible. Ugh, it smells like something died. I muttered to myself. The breeze died down, and the smell went with it. Ugh, I said, setting off again and picking up the pace. I couldn't see any buzzards around, but if there was something dead nearby, I didn't want to be anywhere near it when the wind kicked up again. The hike in was uneventful. I won't bore you with all the details, but it was great terrain, a clear and easy trail through the desert shrubland. Some hours in, I was breathing hard as I reached a slightly hillier bit of the trail. I came to the top of the rise and saw that the terrain flattened out ahead into a wide plateau. Looking at the sun, it was mid-afternoon, and decided that this was a good place as any to set up camp for the night. I walked another few minutes before stepping off the trail, spotting a nice flat bit of land where the brush had been cleared away. There were the remnants of a campfire in the center, just a few bits of charcoal and some scorched ground. I nodded to myself, taking off my pack and rifle case and placing them on the ground near the old campfire. I spent over an hour bringing in firewood, and another half hour breaking it all up into manageable pieces. There was plenty around, lots of low dead bushes and shrubs around the place. I wanted enough wood for the fire to last easily through the night. The sun was just starting to go down, and it was beginning to get a bit chilly. I stood back and looked at my woodpile. It was quite impressive, and probably way more than I'd actually need. Better to be safe than sorry. I shrugged to myself. The last rays of daylight were peeking over the horizon as I lit the fire, building it up until it was crackling away merrily. I ate a couple of power bars I'd packed as a cold dinner, swigged some water, and sat down on the ground looking up at the stars coming out, feeling very peaceful. That feeling didn't last very long. I heard the wind pick up before I felt it. It whistled between the rocks and shrubs, seeming to whirl around, passing me and then doubling back before arriving. It brought a warmth with it that was odd for the desert at night. That wasn't the only thing it brought, though. I sniffed as the breeze kicked up the flames in my little campfire and screwed up my face. That stench I'd smelled earlier came with it, hot and rotten, like roadkill baking under the sun. I gagged and tried to hold my dinner down. The campfire flared up as the wind hit it, throwing sparks in the air. I watched as they floated into the sky, bright orange spots against the black, almost blending in with the stars. As they burned themselves out, the wind died down. The flames it had kicked up lessened as well. The stench had also died. It was still there in the background, but not being blown in my face anymore. Once the light from the flare-up had dimmed, everything seemed a lot darker. I looked around and shivered involuntarily, realizing just how dark it suddenly was. I looked up at the sky and wished I hadn't chosen a moonless night for my hike. Looked back toward the fire, and then stopped dead. Something was wrong. I blinked hard and looked up again at the sky. The stars were gone. One second they'd been there, and the next they just weren't anymore. As if the wind had blown them out like they were candles. There was nothing overhead, just a sudden blackness all around, seeming to press in against the dome of light my little campfire was throwing out. What the hell? I exclaimed, looking about me. The air hadn't changed the temperature. It was cool, but not cold. But an icy sense of unease was settling over me. I shivered again and tossed a couple of branches on the fire, then drew my jacket closed and zipped it up. Where before I'd been able to faintly see the outline of the scattered shrubs and boulders by the faint starlight, now I couldn't see a thing. There was no horizon anymore. The suddenly black sky blended in completely with where I knew the mountains in the distance were, and I couldn't see anything in the darkness that was pressing in around me. I grabbed my pack and pulled out my phone, turning it on and quickly navigating to the flashlight app. The phone's flash lit up and cast a harsh light on the ground, then flickered and died, the phone turning itself off again. I pressed the power button again, but the screen stayed stubbornly black. Shit, I thought to myself. Reaching back into my pack for my keys, I found the pen light on my keyring and turned it on, which also immediately flickered and turned off. I whacked it a couple of times to no avail before giving up in disgust and stowing my keys and phone back in my pack. I looked around me, shivering with unease again. It was very dark. I couldn't see more than 20 feet on either side of the fire. It was almost as if the light was being forced back in on itself. I couldn't hear anything other than the crackle of the campfire. The whistling of the wind had stopped. A god-awful smell was still in the background, though. Like there was something dead nearby, and... What the hell was that? I heard a noise like someone clearing their throat. A thick, wet... My stomach dropped, my breath catching in my throat for a second. I wasn't alone out here. Looking in the direction the noise had come from, I saw a small flash in the darkness, and then another. A tingle ran up the back of my neck as I realized there was something out there, sitting just outside the reach of the light from the campfire, watching me. My sister has a little dog, and I remembered staying with her once, and it looking at me from a dark room down the hall while I was in the brightly lit lounge. I couldn't see it at all, but I knew it was there from the way the light bounced off its eyes. Dim, yellowy pinpricks in the darkness, about a foot off the ground. What I saw was like that. Only instead of the eyes in the dark being knee-high like my sister's dog, these were 6 feet off the ground. Too tall to be a coyote or even a mountain lion. I thought to myself almost absently, trying to control the fear that was bubbling up inside me. Get out of here! I yelled, standing and waving my arms in the air. It didn't leave. Instead, the eyes came down a couple of feet, like the thing had lowered its head. I slowly moved to put the campfire between me and it moved in turn. I kept moving around the fire, and it kept moving too. I stopped and stared at it, and it stopped and stared right back. Something else was strange. My feet had crunched the gravel as I turned to face it as it circled, but it made no sound at all as it moved. The darkness hid all but the barest outline, and even that was fuzzy at best. Apart from what I assumed were the eyes, all I could see was a slightly darker spot in the blackness. Crouching, I picked up a rock and chucked it in the direction of the eye flashes. The rock sailed through the air, and I lost sight of it in the darkness, but I swear my aim was dead on. It didn't hit anything. I just heard a crunch as the rock fell to the gravel and tumbled away. The flashes in the darkness bobbed up and down slightly. Whatever it wasn't afraid of me, and it seemed to be moving closer. Slowly, very slowly, I reached for the rifle case, unzipping it and taking out my little .22. I pulled the bolt up and back, and then forward and down again, chambering around. As I did, the thing moved again, the eyes coming back and slightly lower, as if it was coiling back on itself, like a cat ready to pounce. I moved my thumb to disengage the safety, pulling the stock slightly into my shoulder and aiming for where I guessed the thing's center mass would be, a bit more than a foot below where the glint of its eyes were. "Don't make me use this!" I yelled at it again. Just go away! I heard a wet sound, like a growl from a dog crunching food in its mouth, and squeezed the trigger. The sound of my little rifle seemed deafeningly loud, splitting the quiet of the night like lightning splits the sky. I lowered it slightly, peering over the barrel towards the thing. It hadn't moved at all after coiling back. It stayed right there, ready to pounce, but there was no way I'd missed. Not at this range. Work the bolt back, I frantically thought to myself. Get another round in, re-aim, squeeze the trigger. Work the bolt, aim, squeeze the trigger. Again. The hammer came down on an empty chamber. The ammunition was spent. I'd only packed the single 5-round magazine, and I had nothing to reload with. I hadn't counted on needing any more than that. The thing shifted slightly, growling again as it moved. The flash from its eyes in the firelight disappeared, and I lost sight of its outline. I lowered my rifle with shaking hands, switching my grip to clutch the still warm barrel like a club, ready to swing the stock into whatever that thing was. Something solid hit me in the back, and I screamed as I spun on the spot, swinging the rifle like a bat. It whooshed through the air, hitting nothing. I took a step back, breathing hard as I saw that familiar glint in the dark, just beyond the border of where the light from the fire showed. It'd gotten behind me in a second. I hadn't heard it move at all, but what had hit me? If it hadn't come into the light... I looked down, and lying at my feet was a single hiking boot. I glanced back up toward the thing. It hadn't moved. It was just there, watching me. I looked back at the boot, which wasn't in the best shape. The fabric was torn, and it was caked in reddish-brown mud. Hang on, I thought, stooping to pick it up. I shifted it closer to the fire for a closer look. Blood. The boot was caked in blood. My head swam, and a fire tore through my nerves. The back of my neck prickling madly, and my skin turning to goose flesh. I found myself on one knee, breathing heavily as I mumbled, oh shit. I looked back up towards the thing, which still hadn't moved. I stood and screamed at it. "What do you want with me?" It didn't answer. I dropped the boot. I jumped as there was a small pop from one of the branches in the fire, but was suddenly struck by an idea. I moved closer to the fire and spotted a branch that only had one end alight. I pulled it from the blaze and turned to face the thing. It growled again as I held up the branch, which rose to more of a snarl as I threw it towards it. The blazing stick lit up the night as it tumbled through the air towards the thing, and a horrified thrill ran up my spine as I caught a better glimpse of the outline of it. Just for a second before it scuttled away from the light. It was huge, as big as a bear, but without any of the mass. Lean as opposed to bulky. It was dark, so dark, that it seemed to flow and blend into the gloom behind it. It had 4 long legs attached to an almost stumpy torso, but it hadn't used all 4 when it moved. It only used the front ones, arms, to push itself upright onto the back legs and then danced madly away on those while its whole body and arms jerked from side to side. God, it was so tall, maybe 8 feet high when moving on its back legs, and it never seemed to get fully upright. The things that glinted in the firelight did seem to be eyes, and the split-second glimpse of its face I caught was enough to make me take a step back in horror. It almost looked human, but deathly wrong. Like if you took a person's face and stretched it forward so it was long, like a horse's head. The mouth, though, it wasn't small like a horse's. It stretched all the way back to where the face met the rest of the skull. The mouth was stuffed full of far too many rotten-looking teeth, stained in red places. I think my legs gave way then. I found myself sitting on the ground, hugging my knees, rocking back and forth. What in the hell was that thing, and what did it want with me? The blood-stained boot didn't exactly fill me with hope that it was friendly. I used a shaking hand to grab some more sticks from the woodpile and feed the campfire. Whatever that thing was, it hadn't come into the light, and it moved away when the fire came near it. I gave a silent thanks to whatever urge had made me drag in as much wood as I had. The eyes had stopped moving again, and it seemed the thing was content for the time being just to sit in the dark and stare at me. I stared right back, trying to think of what the hell was going on. We stayed like that for a long while, looking at each other. Somewhere not too far off, a coyote howled. The eyes turned and bobbed up and down slightly in the direction of the howl. Was it sniffing the air? It turned back to face me, and it grunted? Whatever the noise was, it sounded dissatisfied somehow. The thing turned around again, and I saw the barest smudge of an outline moving off into the darkness towards the house. Within seconds it was gone from sight, and as it faded from view, so did its stench. I sat there, frozen for a moment, and then burst upwards, boots scrabbling for grip on the loose gravel as I came to my feet. I frantically grabbed at my pack and swung it onto one shoulder, stooped to pick up my rifle, and swung that by its strap onto the other shoulder, and then hesitated, torn by indecision. Dare I risk it? I clenched my jaw and tried to swallow down the rising sense of fear. I picked up one foot and took a step away from the fire, wincing as the gravel clutched underneath, which seemed deafeningly loud in the silence that was broken only otherwise by the fire. I peered around, muscles tensing with anticipation, but saw no sign of the thing. I took another step. The gravel crunched again. Still no sign of it. I relaxed ever so slightly, took a deep breath, and started briskly walking toward the trail. Once I hit it, I could turn right and was confident enough I could follow it back to the parking lot, even in the dark. I'd taken no more than a half-dozen hurried steps when I stopped dead, frozen in place. I could smell it again, the reek bringing the bile up in my throat. Heart racing, I turned my head slightly to the left and saw that glint in the dark. The light from the fire had dimmed as I'd moved away from it, but I was still just close enough for me to see that familiar reflection of the flames in its eyes again. A rumble came out of the darkness. A growl? I slid my front foot backwards, slowly moving back towards the fire, never taking my eyes off where it seemed to be in the darkness. I reached the fireside and slid my back rifle off my shoulder, laying them on the ground and sitting down next to them. As I did, I heard the coyote howl again. The thing seemed to grunt, and then it faded into the darkness as it turned away from me. What the hell was I going to do? It was like the thing was playing with me, but I wasn't going to risk making a run for it again. No way did I want it to catch me in the dark. The darkness had seemed to kill my phone and flashlight when it settled in, and any flaming torch I took from the fire would burn out well before I made it back to my car. I still had my lighter, but there was no way that'd make enough of a difference to keep it away. The coyote began to howl once more, but the howl cut off quickly, turning into a snarl. I listened closely as the snarl became pained and then desperate yelps, and held my breath as they cut off, replaced by the sounds of something snapping, crunching, and splattering. I breathed deeply, listening as I tried to slow my hammering heart down. Nothing. Once again, all I could hear was the crackling of the fire. I shut my eyes, listening harder, and shrieked as something hit the ground next to me, scrabbling backwards on my butt away from it, waiting for it to leap up and grab me. I got a few yards away when I stopped and just sat there, hyperventilating, staring at the ruined pile of gray fur and red gore that lay in front of me. It was the coyote, or what was left of the coyote. It was a mess. It looked like every bone in its body had been pulverized, and its front legs were completely missing, but raggedly missing. Like they'd been torn away from it rather than cleanly cut or bitten off. Worst of all, its head was facing the wrong way, twisted around until it was entirely backwards. Blood seeped from the open mouth, collecting into drops that each hit the dusty gravel with a soft splat. I shuddered and hugged my knees tight, rocking back and forth slightly. This must have been the coyote I'd heard earlier, the one the thing went after. Oh shit. I stood. Where is it now? I circled on the spot, looking out into the dark. There, on the other side of the fire, just beyond the border where the light ended, that familiar reflective yellow double flash. It was still watching me. Fuck you! I screamed at it. I strode to the dead coyote, grabbed it up by its still warm tail, and swung it around, casting it away from the fire towards the thing. It flumped to the ground, not far away from where the light ended. The thing didn't move. I fought to get my breathing under control, kicking dust over the small patch of blood that had pooled where the coyote lay. I looked at my hands, and they were sticky with blood too. I grabbed my water and rinsed the worst of it off, wiping my hands on my pants to dry them. I heard a grunt, and then turned to see one impossibly thin limb reaching in from the shadow to grab the dead coyote by the tail, slowly dragging it out of the light. It was hard to see any detail. It was almost as if it was radiating the darkness out from itself, but I could see that it seemed to end in a hand that looked human, but wrong. The fingers were way too long, they were jointed in too many places, and looked like someone reaching out with a collection of tarantula legs on the end of a stick. It made a pained sort of sound while it was doing it. Maybe the light heard it. The coyote disappeared from view, leaving bloody drag marks in the dust, and I heard horrific ripping and squelching sounds. I guess the thing was tearing it apart and eating it. The eating noises eventually stopped, and the thing grunted, but it sounded unsatisfied somehow. It went back to staring at me. Whatever this thing was, it wanted me, not just the coyote. I picked up some more branches and built up the fire, and then sat down and stared at the reflective eyes in the dark. I don't know how long I sat like that for. It must have been hours. I built up the fire a couple more times and went back to staring at the thing. It'd grunt or growl every now and again, but then it shut up. For the time being, it seemed satisfied to just sit and stare. Eventually, I found my blinks getting longer. Each time, it was harder to open my eyes again. God, I was so tired. The adrenaline spike had long since worn off, and I felt wiped out. Just a second. I'll close my eyes for just a second, I thought to myself as my head began to nod forward. I jerked bolt upright and wide awake at the thrill that ran up my spine as I heard a wet, throaty from behind me. I'd fallen asleep. The fire had burned down low and was mostly just embers, only emitting a faint glow, just enough for me to see that the thing had crept closer as the light had diminished. I must have dozed off for an hour or more. Leaping to my feet, I grabbed some branches from the pile and hurled them into the remnants of the fire, and then fell to my hands and knees so I could frantically blow into the embers, desperately trying to stir them back to life. The light flared up as they caught a light, and I saw it sitting there, way too close, squatted on its haunches like a dog sitting. Long back legs folded up, so what I assumed were knees were up by the sides of its head, and arms extended down to the ground in front of it, holding its torso upright. The light glinted from its eyes as it shifted its head to stare at me again, and hissed as it pushed itself backwards, retreating from the light. As I lost sight of it in the darkness, I heard that wet sound again, like a long tongue smacking against lips. I shuddered. I'd gotten a better look at its eyes in the light this time. They were filled with hunger and pain. There was an intelligence there. Human eyes, not entirely those of an animal. It went back to looking at me, only this time it wasn't silent. It kept growling and grunting, and the noises it was making grew in volume and frequency. It almost sounded desperate. It circled the fire, eyes disappearing from view and then reappearing elsewhere where it'd growl from the dark. But it never came into the firelight. I didn't say anything. I just fed the fire and hoped that my stock of firewood would hold out a little longer. I'd brought a lot, but it was diminishing by this point. Then, finally, the thing made a noise I hadn't heard yet. A hiss higher in pitch than anything else it made, and it looked up at the sky before staring at me once more. It made a disgusted sort of noise, and then turned away. I heard the wind kick up, and I could smell the thing's stench again, and then all of a sudden, it was just gone. As the thing went, the smell and the suffocating darkness went with it. I realized I could see clearly around me again. The sky had that deep, dark blue color you see before sunrise, and I could see a few pinpricks of light that could only have been stars. It got progressively lighter and lighter until the sun peeked over the horizon. I'd never been so happy to see the light of day as I was now. I waited another hour and a half until the sun was well in the sky and things were starting to heat up before I dared to make a move. I picked up my things and got the hell out of there, shuddering as I passed the remnants of the coyote, just a bloody patch of gray fur and shattered bones. I jogged the whole time, never pausing, never stopping, never looking behind me. Every time I'd slow, I'd hear the wind whistle again, and I'd catch a whiff of something foul, so I'd pick up the pace again. Hours later, I was just about ready to drop when, there, the start of the trail. I could see down to the car park. Without stopping my jog, I reached back and pulled my backpack off, holding it in one hand and awkwardly cradling the gun case in my other arm as I scrabbled in the pack for my car keys. I almost tripped as the hard trail gave way to the gravel of the parking lot, but managed to keep my footing as I scrabbled towards the car. I fumbled with my keys for what seemed like an age before throwing open the door, tossing my things across and slinging myself into the driver's seat, both hands gripping the wheel with a white-knuckled grip. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror and was taken aback at the haggard, wild-eyed figure that stared back at me. There were rivers of clear skin and the dust caking on my face. I realized I'd been sobbing with relief since I'd been able to see the end of the trail. I looked back out where the trail started and saw dust from the path swirl as the wind picked up once more. I hurriedly rammed the keys into the ignition. I gunned the engine, throwing the car into gear, pulling around quickly and peeling out onto the road. As I sped back towards the city, it wasn't until I hit the main highway before my heart stopped pounding and my breathing slowed to normal levels. A few hours later, less time than it took to drive out there, I was not doing the speed limit. I was home, with my doors locked and the sunlight streaming in through the windows. My phone turned on after I'd plugged it in. Now you work. A day or so later, I called the park services and told them that I'd been stalked by some mountain lions on the trail, and they removed the area from the information section of their website. Nobody really went there anyway, they said. I didn't mention the abandoned car or the bloody boot, and didn't tell anyone what really happened. And after all, who would have believed me if I did? There was no point in sending anyone else into danger. Later, I started reading up on some local folklore, but stopped pretty quickly. I came across something that made me shake at the description of it. I'm fairly sure I now know what the thing was, but I decided I wouldn't look any more into it, and I tried to just put it all out of my head. It hasn't really worked. My breath catches in my throat every time I go into a dark room while I fumble around for the light switch. I don't hike much anymore. If I do go hiking, then it's strictly along well-used trails, and I never ever do an overnighter. I had work transfer me to a branch a long, long way away from the desert. I couldn't deal with the feeling of hot wind anymore. I'm somewhere where it snows now. My encounter left me with a lot of unanswered questions, but one question ranks above all the rest. And it's something I'm not really sure I want to know the answer to. If that thing I read about is real, then what else is real and hiding out there in the dark?